platform providers come into the mix? Like, just take Apple, for example. How are they going to permit real money gambling apps? And how is the financial going to work? Are they going to take their 30%? Are they going to put a cap of, like on a lot of our clients, $99 for any purchases? They're not going to allow people to do a $1,000 coin purchase. How are they going to be in the mix and concerned about fraud and their reputation?
I don't know. What I can do is tell you what they do in the UK right now. So Google will not allow any real money gambling apps, so completely closed for the gameplay. They will take money for advertising, which is kind of interesting. They will take money for advertising as long as you can prove that you have a license or have got the permission of a license holder. iOS, Apple, the only country they do allow real money gambling apps is the UK. Again, you just have to prove that you've got a license, and it's pretty straightforward. They do not take 30%. They don't take any. They don't get involved in the payment processing at all. They let you get on with it in whatever way you want to get on with it, which is outside their normal process.
So when you buy coins within the app, it's not going through your iTunes account and charging your credit card?
When you're not buying coins, you're depositing. You're taking money from your bank account, putting it in a bank account held for you by the gambling company that is regulated by whatever authority you're licensed under.
Got it.
So it's not actually a transfer of money at that point. It's just a deposit in an account, and yeah, they keep out of that. And then Facebook is now into real money gambling in the UK. They have got 4 or 5 companies now they've allowed to put on the platform, and their terms are completely secret. I've got no idea what they are taking. Experience suggests, and the way people talk about it, it is very expensive, but they are now getting into it, and who knows what they'll do here in the US. But it's none of them will talk about the US. I mean, we're talking to them all the time. They all say they don't know anything, which somebody somewhere is working on it.
If I'm not mistaken, I think about a month ago, Apple changed its policies and terms and conditions and made it clear that they're open to allowing apps that are taking real money wagering pursuant to regulated licenses, is my understanding. So if you have
in the US as well.
There was no limitation of jurisdiction. So is that right?
Yeah, and for things that are more like sweepstakes-based models, if you're doing something, Facebook has actually changed their terms of service recently to be more permissive. It used to be very limited what you could do with kind of sweepstakes-based models through Facebook. And so I think the key point there is that as we all know, the kind of the terms of service for the platforms change from time to time. You have to stay abreast of what they're doing, and I think they'll continue to change as there's a pot of money out there for these companies. They also know that there's regulatory nightmares and criminal penalties for some of this stuff, so they're proceeding cautiously. But I think you'll see more in that direction as time goes on.
If I might add, iOS in the UK, so what Apple does is that the payment flow for a deposit goes through a mobile web transaction, so it doesn't actually touch iTunes. It doesn't go through the traditional platform. Facebook is very expensive, but it's less than 30%. I mean, it has to be for this to work. On the US, yeah, they are sort of shockingly silent. And if I might make a plug for Pillsbury and Just in particular, or for Comcast Ventures, we led FanDuel's last round, but outside of that, we are big fans of Pillsbury and what you guys do for us for the rest of our portfolio. So thanks for having us.
Thank you. And that was not even a paid endorsement, so thank you very much.
I would echo that, by the way. Absolutely.
Thank you. So cover that. Okay, so we wanted to just kind of give you an example of some of the kind of enforcements that have occurred that are relevant. And there's a lot of different things that have happened. The first one I want to talk a little about is the complicates. And this was actually in Japan, but I don't know how many of you are familiar with this mechanic, but complicates is a technique not unlike McDonald's Monopoly in some ways, in that you would purchase virtual goods. You purchased basically a package of virtual goods, but it was random. You didn't know what you were getting. So you paid real money, but you always got something. There was no chance you weren't going to get virtual goods. And at least as I understand the facts, theoretically, if you paid $3, let's say, you would get at least $3 worth of virtual goods, and maybe more. You could have got some that were rare. There was a random element there. But there was also another component to that, and that is if you got a collection of a certain set of virtual goods, then you would get some super rare virtual good. And there were several publicly traded game companies over there who are using this mechanic and making a ton of money. It was alleged that at some point that the game companies, and this is to a point that Gerard mentioned earlier, the difference between regulated gambling and non-regulated is that you can get away with a lot more with the non-regulated. And you can change things on the fly. And the allegations were that they were kind of really testing people. So instead of giving out that final piece that people needed to complete the collection and to award the super rare items, they were kind of stringing people along, getting to see how much money people would pay. That was the allegation. What ended up happening was the equivalent of the FTC over there, the Japanese Consumer Protection Bureau, or I don't know if I got that exactly right, but that agency, because people started complaining about it from a consumer protection perspective, that mechanic ended up getting shut down. It was not declared to be illegal gambling, as far as I understand it. It was basically the companies agreed to cease using that mechanic. It was pretty significant. There were, I think, one of the companies lost about 20% market cap the day that they announced they were foregoing that mechanic. And I think it kind of raises a couple of, I think, interesting points. Is that there's a lot of gray area here that we've talked about, and I think one of the things that is I think helpful to understand from a business perspective is that if you're doing something that's pushing the envelope a little bit, is be clear with consumers. Don't do things you wouldn't want consumers knowing you're doing, because at some point they're probably going to find out, and if they start complaining, that's when the regulators will take notice and care. So, one of the things that was alleged in connection with all that is that there really was no published odds, right? Most of the times when there's a sweepstakes, one of the requirements is what are your chances of winning? And in this case, they not only was there no published odds, it was allegedly the odds were changing. And those types of things the regulators, kind of get concerned about. But
can I just add to that?
Please do, yeah.
Because I think there were two things. There was this notion that when you were first spending money, the probability of getting these goods was quite high, and the more you spent, the odds got lower and lower and lower and lower. So you were being, very clearly tested, as you say, if they were doing what they said. But it was also very much targeted at teens and young adults. They were the ones who were most affected. So there was a huge amount of outrage as the story came out. And of course that obviously makes politicians and regulators get much, much more engaged than if it's the older people who are adults who are not being taken advantage of in such a way.
Yeah, and I think one of the other points that I kind of get as a takeaway from that is we see many companies will come to us with a very interesting business model or a gamblification mechanic, and say we want your opinion. Is this legal or is this not legal? And we give them our analysis, and we tell them where the concerns are and why. In some cases, we don't recommend you do this because, and they're like, yeah, but so and so is doing this. There's another company doing something almost just like this. And there's usually one of two things that we respond to that. Either there is it could be a minor factual difference that makes so and so's business legal and yours not, or the mere fact that so and so is doing it and hasn't been shut down yet doesn't mean they won't be. And if you do what they're doing, you may all go down together, just like what happened with the complicates. There was 4 companies that were all targeted at once. So, do your own independent analysis. And while it's very, we've heard these discussions at the executive level. These guys our competitors are making a lot of money doing this. Why are our lawyers telling us we can't do it? That's a really tough question and a real tough decision to have to make when it's a very gray business model. And that's where you have to decide how much risk you're willing to take and whether you want to be on the leading edge or at least have some factual distinction so that arguably you're in a safer zone and maybe not a target in the first wave of enforcements. The next case I want to talk about, which I think is really interesting, is these internet sweepstakes cafes. I don't know how many of you have heard about these. It's very popular in Florida and a number of other states. And the way it generally works is, again, very much like the monopoly model. You basically buy internet time at these facilities that have computers, printers, all kinds of business services. They're legitimate business operations if you want to buy internet time and use the services. And they charge you a relatively reasonable fee for access on a per minute basis, comparable to what you'd pay in other places. The difference is you also get, for depending on how many minutes you purchase, you get entries into the sweepstakes. And the sweepstakes are really kind of more like almost like instant win type things. You go on the computer, you click, and you determine for each of the entries whether you won or not. And there's companies making an incredible amount of money off of these internet sweepstakes cafes, and people weren't really using the internet time very much. And they also, taking a lesson from the McDonald's scenario, said you don't even have to buy the internet time. If people want to come in, you could put a request in and we'll give you a free chance to win, just like if someone was getting the chances with what they purchased. So the folks that were running these operations said this is just like, we're setting this model up, it's just like the McDonald's things, free alternative means of entry, and the Florida regulators really came down on these guys. And in fact, one of the guys who was one of the key executives was actually a lawyer and a former head of one of the bar associations down there. And he was there was a criminal trial. He had 150 counts alleged against him of different criminal violations. And the judge threw out 50 before it went to verdict, and he was convicted on the other 100. Hasn't been sentenced yet, but he's going. The key difference, and this is where I think an example of one fact can make a difference, and the one fact I didn't tell you yet is that when you won, right, if you had your sweepstakes ticket was a winner, you would typically get more internet minutes. And they were saying, well, this is just like a virtual currency. You can use these internet minutes to buy more things. It's like winning virtual currency in a game. The difference, though, is you could cash in your unused minutes, not just what you originally purchased, but anything that you won as well. So there was a cash-out mechanism. You didn't really cash out your Big Mac, right? You ate it. So, and I'm not sure you can return a Big Mac. So that was one of the big factors, that even though they went through painstaking steps to make their model look very, very much like a legitimate product promotion, that one factor, I think, was, in my mind, the biggest thing that changed the whole decision. So, the Florida has changed their sweepstakes laws, and they've really clamped down on a lot of activity. I know Melissa was telling me too that there's what other states have done. Is Ohio? You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think Ohio, they're again, every state is a little different. I think in Ohio, they had basically a law that just limited the amount of cash prizes to $10, so it wouldn't be anything of significance, but there was a lot of opposition politically, and they were trying to get on a referendum something that would pretty much ban all internet sweepstakes. That wasn't quite successful, but they have a limit of $10 now for any kind of prize winnings.
Yeah. So again, different states take different approaches, and kind of the facts can make a huge difference. The last kind of enforcement I want to talk about, and we'll kind of throw it open to any of the questions, was, and I think this is kind of interesting, and again, we're not going to answer necessarily a legal question, but can identify it for you. But there's a company called InTrade, which operated out of, was it UK or Ireland, or somewhere over there, yeah. And they operated what was called prediction markets. We touched on those briefly earlier, and prediction markets are things where you could use, wager real money on a prediction. So, they would take money on presidential elections. And there was, the way the prediction markets work is that depending on the number of people who predict yes or no, or whichever side they predict. So for the last presidential election, I think, going into the elections, there was like 70% of the people thought Obama would win. So in order to win a $1 prize, you had to wager 70 cents. And if you wanted to bet on Romney, it would cost you 30 cents to win the dollar, right? So depending on how many people are on one side, the odds change. The interesting thing about prediction markets, and there's a lot of these being set up in the US right now, a lot of non-real money markets, they are amazing predictors of actual events. The factual knowledge that is being derived from these prediction markets is astounding. If it's for real money, though, it's probably illegal, with one exception in Iowa, which I'll touch on in a second. But what was interesting was InTrade got sued by the Commodities Future Trading Commission. Now, Intrade was operating in Ireland, and they were sued not by the DOJ or it was the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. And the reason was one of the things you could take predictions on was whether, say, gold would close above or below, above a certain value, on a particular day. Again, it's a yes/no bet. The CFTC said that was basically offering interest in securities, or commodities rather. And they took the position, now in trade, roughly 80%, I believe, of their revenue came from the US, even though they were based over there. And the CFTC sued in trade, and they ultimately ended up agreeing to shut down and stop servicing the US. Whether or not the U.S. has a right to do that is a very hotly debated topic. We're at war, and from a legal perspective, with Aruba, is it, that has Antigua. They believe that they can serve U.S. customers from over there, and that to prevent it is the U.S. is overstepping its bounds. That's another whole area that, unless you guys have anything else you want to say on, I'm just going to raise it and not take a position on it. Okay. So I think it just goes to show that, I mean, if you're in the U.S., obviously the U.S. law is going to apply to you. If you're outside the U.S. law may apply to you as well. So just be aware of that. So what questions do we all have?
I have a question for Gerard again, and Melissa. What are the economics behind U.S. indie developers that have a slots game or a poker game and licensing it to someone that's licensed in the U.K.? Is that happening? What should clients that are considering that be aware of, and what are the economics like?
Well, so the economics are fine. I'll come back to that. But the problem for an indie developer trying to license into a real money game company is you haven't typically built the game for the real money world. To operate in a real money world, you've got the client, so sitting on the mobile phone or on the desktop or whatever, and basically all it is a pre-rendering engine. There is no real intelligent logic there of the game if it's real money. And what you have on the server side is what we think of as the bank server, and that's completely separated from the remote gaming server. And the remote gaming server does all the smart stuff around talking to a licensed random number generator. The game server itself has been licensed and approved, and its outcome then tells the client what to do. In the meantime, you're talking to a bank in a completely different server that's checking who the customer is, make sure that they actually know who they are, where they're located, whether they are money laundering because of behavioral patterns, whether they are doing any other nefarious activities. Indie developers sitting in the US are not worried about those two things. What they're doing is trying to make a very pretty game that engages some people to give some pennies over in the social world. There are a couple of guys who tried to automate all of that good stuff on the back end and resell it. I think the jury's still out on whether that's going to really work. And so it's really, I think that's it's very tough. I know there's a lot of talk going on about doing that, but it's unproven, I think, at scale.
Other questions? Yes.
Does anyone on the panel know of any examples of games that are being developed primarily for foreign markets? I'm thinking China primarily, that end up coming over here afterwards and turn out to be illegal in any way? Are there any things that are too spicy that happen outside?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. Can you? Yeah. I mean, there are, issues with more, I'd say, the business models. Like, for example, going the other direction, like, China has outlawed the, resale of virtual currencies, for example. So there are certain things that you might be able to do here, but you can't do there. And it could be vice versa as well. I'm not as familiar with Chinese law, so I don't know what other examples would be.
Yeah, actually, the two examples that really come to mind are just basic sports betting. Like, too spicy for the US. It's crazy when there's so much money being. I was not in Pillsbury. I was in another law firm, going through a whole bunch of legal work on gambling, and the receptionist was organizing a sweepstake for the week on who was going to win the NFL that week, I don't know. And they were sending it between all the offices of this law firm. So they were doing it over the internet, cross office, completely illegal. And, it was like, these guys were giving me advice on what was what. So that was great.
Awesome.
So,
Hence the saying, any lawyer who represents himself has a fool for a client.
So sports betting. But the whole discussion around the in-trade and prediction markets, that was the core technology that Betfair built its whole business on. So not peer-to-peer real money betting. That was a company, we acquired a company that did that. And they were not very successful because people don't want to bet real money peer-to-peer. So I lose to you once, okay. I lose to you twice, oh, that's not good. I lose to you 3 times, I'm never going to bet with you again. That wasn't a fun experience.
It's like Ben's lab rats.
That's right. So peer-to-peer real money betting clearly hasn't worked overseas. What has worked is anonymous many-to-many betting. And so Betfair runs, and it's why in-trade came allegedly illegally to the USA, because we crushed them in the UK. We had scale, and just like eBay, when you want liquidity to bet against other people, you go to the place where everyone is betting. And that is way too spicy for the USA. I've spent time with every regulatory body in the USA. I've spent time with horse racing, and it is just too spicy. Like the idea that you bet, because if somebody's betting that you're going to win, somebody is explicitly saying you are going to lose. Now, when you just place a sports bet, typically you don't explicitly say someone's going to lose. You just say it implicitly. But that explicit statement that a horse will not win or a team will not score a goal is just far too spicy for the US, which I don't get.
Have you dealt in the sort of the concept of optional consideration that would not increase chances to win, but it might enhance the gameplay experience?
Yeah, really interesting. Yes, is a short answer. So, for example, there are some non-real money prediction markets where it's free to play. You may get an allocation of virtual currency, and you can allocate portions of that virtual currency on certain propositions. And there can be, over a period of time, whoever accumulates the most currency based on the virtual currency based on those predictions will win a cash prize. And again, since there was no consideration up front, those are generally deemed to be not illegal. What the question goes to is, how can you monetize that? So let's say, for example, that part of the rules are that you can only allocate, let's say you got 5,000 units of virtual currency at the beginning of the week. You can only allocate 500 units to any one proposition. That's just part of the rules. But if you're willing to pay $1, you can now allocate 700 units. So that $1 is not going to making a wager. It's going to get you essentially the equivalent of what's a power-up in a game. It's giving you a sword, so to speak, a more powerful weapon to play the game with. And I'm not aware of any decision that has really kind of addressed that. We have seen examples of people that are doing that. And I can tell you that there's, it goes to the question of what is consideration and whether that would deem to be consideration. The analysis does probably vary based on different states, and there are certain states you may want to avoid if you're doing that. But it's an interesting area that hasn't been fully legally tested. But a very interesting business model.
Yeah.
And people are doing it. So it's a question of whether you want to see if they can get away with it and where you want to join them.
I've heard that it also the sort of the category that you're playing in kind of can influence a little bit of sort of so for example, we're in sort of the sports outcome prediction arena, right? And I've heard that kind of that might be a little bit more scrutinized just simply because it's dealing in that.
Well, it is, and I think to go back to the question earlier, and I think Melissa answered part of it with the Wire Act and why does it relate to sports betting. I mean, back then it was really designed to go after the mafia for taking, illegal book. But there's also there's still the Professional Amateur Sports Protection Act, I think is what it's called, PASPA, which is one of the federal statutes actually is substantive and prevents sports betting as well. So there's another thing there. And the reason, I think one of the other reasons for that sports is treated differently is that you can influence the outcome of a sporting event through refs or players, people throwing games and stuff, and we've seen examples of that. And so I think that's an area where there's more concern about the fairness in the betting. And so that's one reason why I think sports is treated differently. And you're right, depending on how you're doing the propositions, if the propositions are individual outcomes of individual games, I'd say that's probably a riskier proposition. If it's more of a fantasy sports league, the reason fantasy sports is different than traditional sports is that it's a fantasy team. It's not there's not like the ability to influence the outcome of a single event to impact who wins the sports league. At least that's some of the rationale for why fantasy sports.
So
is different.
parlays might be better.
So the more you get to where an individual event is outcome determinative or determinative part of the outcome, right? If it's a parlay of two actual games, it's still either of those games or both could be influenced. So I'm not sure that changes the analysis a whole lot. It's when you're looking at the fantasy side or other aspects.
Only 3-team teasers.
Right. But again,
as any gambling knows. Yeah.
Well, but then in daily fantasy has been pushing that down to, like, there's variations within daily fantasy sites where you're just picking like player versus player 5 times, and it's like a VIG model versus a rake model.
Like Star Street.
And the more you go to an individual event, if you look at this is legal, this is white, this is black, this is illegal, and everything in the middle is gray, the more you go from true fantasy sports, which is legal, to individual outcomes, you're getting a lot closer to this line if you're not crossing it. So it's a question of, again, of like a lot of these things, it's risk management.
What's the general legal landscape? Like you mentioned for UGA, the Fantasy Association lobbyists did a good job of carving that out. Like, fantasy's a little bit, I'm not saying it is completely of a proxy for sports betting, albeit you can't bet on the downside in the United States. And it's, daily fantasy's burgeoning around that. Is there like a growing lobbyist movement that's sort of protecting that part of the sort of the grayer landscape?
Well, I mean, at the federal level, the lobbying's been done, and they got the carve out in the law for the most part. But you still have to deal with whether or not it's legal under the state laws. As you get to the individual, events, and again, those laws were written a long time ago before any of these things were envisioned. So the lobbyists weren't able to influence the outcomes of those laws. Now, to the extent that there's many states right now that are drafting new legislation, and Melissa's been involved with some of this. Those issues are getting taken